What is burst DPS, sustained DPS, and magazine damage? Now, these might seem like simple questions, and for some of you, I imagine you're looking at me like I'm some sort of idiot. However, I did a video just under a week ago of where I compared Opening Shot, Tetrad, Pierce Duel 3, Critical Boost 3, their burst and sustained capabilities, and tried to go through it in as much detail as I could in as short a time as possible. However, some people seem to be very confused as to why, despite that these being the main results, I said that Opening Shot isn't actually all that powerful, despite the fact that, as you can see on Opening Shot, it has the largest buff of 10.65% on sustained DPS, but on burst DPS, it's not really better than having literally nothing on your weapon at all. So why is it that I'm saying that this sustained DPS isn't actually as powerful as a lot of people think? It also then kind of devolved into, I tried to keep it polite and I tried to keep it civil. However, I won't lie that I was getting frustrated because some of the responses that I was getting were very weird. Like, there were some people saying that I've got magazine damage and DPS, burst DPS confused. Some people not understanding the problems with measuring in pure sustain, and others arguing that I have my definitions and my terminology mixed up. The problem is, literally a 5-minute Google can dispel all of these arguments, so I'm just going to try and put them all in a video with a little bit of sass and a little bit of about me, so that maybe we can understand my position here. Burst DPS. In order to calculate this, we have the rate per minute divided by 60. So if you stroke your knob 100 times a minute and divide it by 60, that means you did a grand total of 1.666666 recurring strokes per second. Ends in a 7 at the last one because obviously it rounds up. Now, to find the value of something that happens per second, you then actually have to add a value. So this would be your strokes per second. Say, for example, each stroke does, 2 points of lovey-dovey feelings towards the final end goal. That is 1.666 recurring times 2, which equals 3.333 recurring. This equation takes place in two forms. You have rate per minute times value, or we have the rate per minute divided by 60 times the value. They are equal to the same thing, because rate per minute divided by 60 just finds your rate per second. So if you know your rate per second, you can skip the divided by 60. If you don't know your rate per second, but you know your rate per minute, divide it by 60 and then multiply it by your value. This is essentially rounds per minute divided by 60 times damage. This is how we find our burst DPS. Other areas where this is actually used is in cardiology. If you've ever been hooked up to one of those machines that tells you your beats per minute, it literally needs 2 beats. Your first beat and the second beat. And then it will measure the time between, multiply it by 60, ta-da, there's your beats per minute. That's literally how it works. Same thing happens with cars, miles per hour, kilometers per hour. This is essentially the exact same. It's the same events per second equation. It's just being utilized in a different way. So the idea that I've got on my burst DPS calculation wrong or misunderstanding what burst is a little bit silly, because either doctors would have killed hundreds of thousands of people by now, or no one would be going anywhere because we'd all be moving at like 1 mile an hour, or we'd all be trying to drive at the speed of light. Magazine damage. This one's actually really easy. It's the amount that you have times the value. So if you do 90 damage a hit and you can do 10 hits before you have to reload, it's literally just 90 times 10. That will give you 900. Why this isn't burst DPS, as I had a few people try to tell me that magazine damage is burst DPS, is completely and utterly wrong, is because burst DPS is a rate. It is an averaged rate. The rate in which you are able to do X thing. To give a rather extreme example of this, if I was to ask for what your heart rate is, most people, a resting healthy heart rate is between 60 and 100 beats per minute. But if you were to confuse this with magazine damage, what you would then give me is your total amount of heartbeats since you were born. Just so that we can maybe understand the difference in this. This actually means that the average human heart beats at around 100,000 times per day. So after like, I don't know, say you're 40 years old, that's like 2.5 billion times. Do you understand the difference now between a rate, 60 to 100 beats per minute, and magazine damage, which is a total value, which would be like 2.5 billion. This is a huge, huge difference. Not to mention the fact that one is managing something per second. What is your average damage done per second? We don't care about 2 seconds. We don't care about 3 seconds, 4, 5. We care about that one particular second. That's what DPS is. So to confuse this with magazine damage, there becomes so many different variables. One, both might have a 4-round magazine, but one person might have fired all 4 rounds off as fast as possible, whereas another person might have fired off 2 rounds, went and made a cup of coffee, sat back down, shot another round, and then doom scrolled Instagram for 30 years, and then shot their final round. The total magazine damage for both people will be the same, but the rate in which it happened is massively, massively different. So to confuse magazine damage with burst DPS is, I can't even say it's like a bad wrong. It's so wrong, it's almost hilarious. So no, this is not a thing. Magazine damage is a worthwhile stat, but it's only really a worthwhile stat if you're going to fire off all of those rounds as fast as whatever weapon it is you're using actively allows, because that is going to be your total period of damage, which you can then multiply by your entire firing time, as well as your reload to get your sustained DPS, which is probably the longest equation on this list. So we have the amount times the value, which gets us our magazine damage, or total magazine damage. This is then divided by the natural pause. This would be like a reload in the weapon, or if there's a charge time within the weapon, plus the amount. So pause plus the amount is the total firing time from the first bullet all the way through to the last, plus the natural pause, and then just before we're about to go straight into our second set of values, that's where the timer cuts out, and then this will then be further divided by the rate per minutes or seconds. This gives us our sustained DPS. Now, if we were to graph any form of like damage metric and actually put it in accurately over a period of time, it would probably look something along the lines of this. This is actually from an entirely separate game, though for this purpose it is perfectly fine. At 0, we have 0 damage, and as we start shooting, there is a climb. As it's climbing, when it hits its peak on the first initial climb, the value between point 0 and where it then plateaus, that value is our total magazine damage. The rate in which it climbs, X amount per second, is our DPS, our burst DPS. What sustained DPS measures is essentially from the point 0 to the end of the first plateau. To give a visual aid to this, the big red line shooting off into space is essentially the metric for burst DPS, while that green line, as I said, going from point 0 to the end of the first plateau, which would be our reload, and then to the second and then third, that is our sustained DPS. This is what both of these metrics are measuring. Going back to when I said measuring and sustained DPS isn't always going to be accurate, why is that? Because when you calculate sustained DPS, the only thing it is measuring with that plateau is the reload. It's not going to measure you getting hit. It's not going to measure you taking a potion. It's not going to measure you getting to and from the monster. That is just purely you stand there, you fire, you reload, you fire again. The only time and where you're going to get an accurate measure on any of your sustained DPS is going to be the training room. But hey, at least in some respects it does follow the arcing of the actual plotted damage, whereas burst DPS shoots off into space. Correct. The problem is burst DPS isn't actually measuring total damage. It's measuring the rate of damage that you would do at any given second. To show what I mean, if we measure that point on the arrow, it will give us X number. We'll say 120, just for argument's sake. The exact value where that arrow is for that 1 second burst DPS, damage per second, is 120. You can now move that arrow anywhere along that line, and it is still 120 because we're measuring it in a 1 second interval. The length of the line would just be the total damage that you would have dealt throughout that period. So if you move that line from 3 seconds to 6 seconds, the total damage would have doubled. But the DPS has remained the exact same. For further evidence of this, I recruited a friend who has installed the DPS tracker for Monster Hunter Wilds and got him to send me 2 screenshots of our damage, specifically mine, because I was the only one probably running a consistent build throughout, against 2 different monsters. This is the math for the build I was running with none of the buffs active. That is my damage of 205 on water element, and I checked it again with thunder, which was the other element I was using. Mag size, the reload, the magazine damage, the burst DPS, the sustained DPS. I believe I was running 2-piece Gore Magala, Guardian Arc-Veiled gloves, the normal Arc-Veiled chest, and Jinder had helmet. I had like Wex 5, Agitator 4, Burst 1, a few other things, antivirus, bloody blah. Then with the Corrupted Mantle, Burst at full buff, Agitator kicking in, my damage goes up to 328 per shot. There is a total of 16% difference between no buff and full buff. I believe the actual number is like 16.1, so we're just going to go with 16%. The first monster we fought as a group was Arc-Veiled. He moves around a lot. You miss a few shots. You don't always hit your weak points. I got hit a few times. And he also likes to run around like a lunatic and do really weird dumb stuff, as well as pick fights with rather random monsters and get himself stuck in really weird and awkward situations. This is what the DPS tracker said that I did. 36.5 damage per second. One thing to note as well, this damage tracker starts calculating the moment the quest starts. So that time that you're moving to the monster is still counted in all of your DPS calculations, and we'll take that into account as an average over time as well. But still, it took a minute, about 30 seconds to get to the monster. He ran away twice. I got hit a few times, had to take a potion or 2. Certain points I wasn't able to do my optimal amount of damage because of movement, etc, etc. The next one was a Gravios with a water heavy bowgun. For those of you that know, you can probably see where this is going already. Took about 10 seconds to get to him, and the moment we got to him, due to the fact that I'm running a water heavy bowgun and the other 3 players were all running some weird like paralysis longsword or paralysis switch axe, etc, etc. Yeah, 150.3 damage per second. This is not even a remotely worthwhile metric. Having sustained DPS in Monster Hunter Wilds is very important. Very important. Because you're not killing the monster in a single magazine, so you're going to need decent sustain in order to up your times, up your overall value of the build, the stats and what you need. That being said, using sustained DPS for any form of measuring stick on how a build should or could perform is utterly mental. Even against the Gravios, I was unable to even reach my maximum potential of 182.2 damage per second through sustained DPS. I'm 150, and at full buff it goes up to 211. And then against something like an Arc-Veiled, well, I'm doing nearly 500% more in calculated than actual. So with all of the variables in place, sustained DPS shouldn't be used as a measuring stick. You do need it. I'm not denying its importance. But in order to measure in that way, things get way too complex. There's far too many variables for you to even want to try and calculate in that manner. But do you know what all of these things will have in common? The burst DPS is probably about 80% accurate the whole way through. Since the only thing really burst DPS cares about is, did you hit the monster? Yes, cool. What was your average damage when you were hitting the monster? What is the interval between you hitting monster? Here's your burst DPS. That's literally it. That is literally it. If you don't hit the monster, you get 0. If you do hit the monster, you get a value. Whereas with sustained it's always changing. It fluctuates far too much. In another game that I played, something like Division 2, sustained DPS is easier to calculate because things die a lot quicker. You can even sometimes kill 2 or 3 things within a single mag. So your sustained DPS more has a value of how many things can you kill per magazine or during a certain time period rather than how quick can you kill. So sustained DPS is going to be the better use, but it's also the more useless metric simply because there's no way to actually guarantee it. Whereas burst DPS isn't going to be as important, though it is still a massively important area to calculate for 2 simple reasons. If you give your burst DPS a 10% increase, but without changing things like reload and mag size, you've also given your sustained DPS that increase. Increasing your reload and your mag size will only affect sustain, but anything that affects your burst specifically will also affect mag damage, sustained, burst, etc, etc. 2, the largest contributor to your sustained DPS is actually your burst DPS. So having a higher burst immediately means having a higher sustain. Might not be as high as you like, but considering it's an easier metric to measure throughout the entirety of the game, you'd be much better off just trying to stick with upping your burst to up your sustain. Will this be the most optimal way to play? No, but you can at least measure it to at least, I'd say, 80% accuracy, whereas with the examples I've demonstrated in this video, my sustained DPS has fluctuated between like being 17% accurate and 53% accurate. So I don't recommend it. Final point, a little bit about me. Why am I so passionate about this? Spent 9 years in the military. This is Royal Engineers, where I had to do a fair few of these sorts of calculations. This one's Coldstream Guards, Queen's Elite. Well, probably King's Elite now, since may she rest in peace. But while I was in Queen's Elite, I've worn a few hats, done a few things, calculated very different things from like fire rates, effective damage ratios, calculated things in like muzzle velocity, humidity, tension weights, grammage. I am just weirdly and oddly very passionate about numbers, and I spend far too much of my life looking at spreadsheets because I enjoy doing it. So I'm passionate about it. So when these conversations come up, I get a little bit snarky, become a little bit of a dick, and I mostly like a good debate. However, there's one thing I don't like when it comes to debating, and that's debating someone who very clearly doesn't know what they're talking about. So instead I make videos like this to hopefully try and clear up a few points. And in saying that, I do hope this helped. Have fun, good luck, don't die. It's bad for the health.